Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm going to create some stitched holiday cards using the new Stitched Bright collection from Spellbinders. This has a few different holiday themed stitching dies. Now stitching on die cuts is new to me, but I've been really enjoying it. So I'm going to create 3 cards in this video. We have 3 different dies here. There's this background die, there is the tree one, as well as the ornaments, or not ornaments, the lights one. I'm going to turn that lights one, or some of the dies from the lights one, into ornaments. Before I start doing my stitching, I know that I'm going to be doing holiday colors with holiday metallics, so I'm using the Sending Joy Sentiments Better Press plate, and I'm going to create some gold embossed sentiments as well as silver embossed sentiments. This set creates 4 different sentiments at once and then die cuts them all at once. And so by doing the silver and the gold, I have a choice of different sentiments to use throughout the video. And I love the fact that you can do several sentiments all at once and then die cut them all at once. It's a huge time saver, and I like creating sentiment, or a lot of sentiments at once, and having extra ones to put aside and use for future cards. So before I do my die cutting of the sentiments, I do line up my die cut. I use some Best Ever Craft tape to tape my die in place to make sure that that's not going to move on me, and then I put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. Now I often do die cutting with the blade facing up, but I do find that when you're die cutting sentiments, it does ride or move the paper on you. So for doing sentiments especially, I do it with the blade side down so that I can see the die and the sentiment through the die. The first card, I'm using this background die here, and I'm going to ink it before time just to give it a little bit of visual dimension. So I have some raindrop cardstock here from Spellbinders, and I'm inking it with some Faded Jeans Distress ink. I'm using the large Spellbinders ink blending tools. These are a dream to work with. They ink blend absolutely beautifully, and the bristles on these brushes are so nice and soft. For my tree, I have it already die cut out of fern cardstock, and I'm doing my ink blending with some Rustic Wilderness Distress ink. I'm only doing my ink blending on the bottom part of the tree piece. I want to have a little bit of visual dimension here, and by having a little bit of darker color at the bottom and then lighter color at the top, I can achieve that. There is some die cuts that go over top of this bottom piece, so when I'm doing the die cutting for this, I am making sure to make it go up above where those die cuts would be so that you can see it a little bit more. I'm just doing my ink blending on my glasswork surface. It works just fine. And for my stitching, I'm going to be using gold thread, silver thread, as well as white thread. Because these are holiday cards, I thought this thread would be absolutely perfect for it. But you could use colored floss if you wanted. For the metallic threads here, I only use 1 strand. But if you're going to use some of the floss, I would pick out 2 strands from the skeins, or I don't know if that's what they're called, so that it's a little bit thicker. When I'm doing my stitching, I do like to tape my end of my thread on the back of the stitching die so that it holds in place and I don't need to worry about it moving on me. I'm also using my thumb and my pointer finger to hold my cardstock, and I will often use my pinky and my ring finger to hold the thread taut. And by doing that, I'm making sure that I don't have any excess thread looping up, or that my thread is so tight that it's curving or bending the cardstock. You can see how quickly and easily this stitching goes. I have my video speed on double speed, but it goes really, really quickly. What I often like to do, because there's so few supplies, is I will gather up what I need, die cut what I need, and then I will go put on a movie and just do a bunch of stitching, having those supplies beside me. Aside from your die cuts and your floss, all you need is the Best Ever Craft tape. You need a pair of scissors to cut your thread, and I like to have my Barely Art glue in the fine line bottle because I like to die cut the solid piece as well. And once I'm done my stitching, I will glue that solid piece onto the back. Because this is going to be glued onto the front of the card and there's floss on the back of here, by having a solid piece on the back, I only have to be gluing cardstock to my background. In this case, the background has stitching on it, but it just gives something better for it to stick to. So with these stitching dies, the Stitched Holiday Trees, there is an insert and an outline. So I cut out the outline just solidly out of the same color cardstock as I do for the front with the outline and the insert. And then once I'm done, like I just showed you here, I put a little bit of that liquid glue on there and glue those two pieces together. I use my reverse tweezers to hold them in place, keeping my hands free to do other things. Often when I'm doing card making, I will use an acrylic block to hold things in place, but I find for these, because of the dimension of the thread, it's not enough weight for it, so I find that the reverse tweezers work much better. Even some paper clips or some clothespins would also work, just something to hold it in place to make sure that that glue has contact with cardstock to cardstock. And then you can be working on your next piece while that is drying. So this Stitched Holiday Tree has 3 different pieces to the tree part, and then there is 3 different pieces to the star part at the top, and each one of these layers has 2 extra layers for the bottom that don't get stitched. They're just accessory pieces, and I have them die cut to the side out of some gold cardstock from the Treasured Gold cardstock pack. I chose the mirror cardstock as well as the pearl finish. Those treasured cardstock packs come in gold, silver, and rose gold, and I'll be using the gold pack as well as the silver pack in this video. Each one of those packs has 15 sheets in it with 3 different finishes. So you get 3 sheets of each finish, and it's great for doing holiday cards because you can pick and choose which finish you want to go with whatever you're working on. And I love having those choices of finishes and knowing that each one of those cardstock is going to coordinate with each other. By the time I'm done stitching that second piece of the Stitched Holiday Tree, I'm ready to take those reverse tweezers off my first piece and use them for the second piece. And then I'm going to do the same thing for doing my stitching on the top piece of the tree. Now the top piece of the tree has just one hole at the top and then a bunch of holes at the bottom. So if they all get looped through that top one and then through that bottom one, but I'm still doing the same, taping the end of my thread on the back at the beginning and once I'm done to make sure that that is nice and secure before gluing those pieces together. When I'm threading my needle, I will often just dampen the ends of the thread, hold them between my thumb and my forefinger, and then hold my needle so that I can see the loop and just kind of wiggle it back and forth. And I find 9 times out of 10, I get the needle threaded that way. You could also use a needle threader if you find that more helpful. I haven't found it necessary to this point yet, but I could see it also being helpful. Once all of these pieces for the Stitched Holiday Tree are done, I'm ready to start adding those gold pieces to the bottom of them. After my pieces have dried, I do like to look at the side of them like I just did, just to make sure there's no areas that kind of got flipped up. Often if there is an area that's didn't quite have enough contact with each other, you can just use your fingers to press that closed. For those gold trim pieces, I'm just using that same Barely Art glue to glue it together, and that fine line bottle means that I can pick and choose how much glue I need. I'll put that acrylic block on top of those pieces to let them dry while I'm assembling the next piece. For my star, I use the same finishes as I did for those gold trim pieces so they coordinate perfectly with each other. Once I'm done this, the middle part of the lower level of the trim has a hole in it, so you can see the green from the tree through it, or if you want, and what I'm going to do is add some gems to it just for a little bit of extra sparkle. These are holiday cards, so this extra sparkle works perfectly with that. Once those trim pieces are dried, I can glue them onto the tree. I could have glued them onto the tree while I was assembling them, but I find it easier to just glue them separately, make sure that the adhesive has dried, and then add them to the tree, put them to the side with my acrylic block on top of it, holding it in place, and then I can start to assemble my tree. And this glue doesn't take very long to dry. I love the fact that it starts to grab the cardstock fairly quickly, so I don't have to wait a long time for those to dry. While I am waiting, I'm going to stitch my star-filled background here. So for this one, I originally was going to use some of the white floss, but then I thought maybe the gold floss would tie it all in a little bit together. Now this one is stitched on the whole background, so this one does take longer than those trees to stitch. I'm only going to show you a little bit of it. and then I'll do a bunch of it off camera because it's going to be fairly repetitive. These are all little kind of starbursts. So all of these stitched pieces or stitched stars go from the center to the outside part of the star, or you can do from the outside to the inside. It really doesn't matter. The look is going to be exactly the same. But I'm doing the same thing with my fingers, holding my piece with my thumb and my pointer finger, and then using my ring finger and my pinky finger to hold that floss. It holds it out of the way as well as holding it nice and tight, but making sure that it's not too tight. I especially like that it holds it out of the way for me, so then I don't need to worry as much about my thread knotting. For this, because there's a lot of stitching on this background, I tended to make or cut my thread a little bit longer than I did for the holiday tree. So there's a little bit more that could knot if it gets all wound and tangled up. I didn't have much of an issue with that. What I do find that I do is if I notice that it's starting to twist on itself, I will hold up the stitched piece and then let my thread and needle hang below it. And that often is enough to let that thread untangle itself, and then you're good to go again. I find that if I don't do that somewhat regularly, that's when I start having issues with knots. By letting it untangle itself, I didn't have a whole lot of issues with it. You can see from the back here that anytime I started and stopped, I taped that piece into place with some Best Ever Craft tape. You only need a tiny little bit. You could use some liquid glue if you wanted as well, but then it's going to take just a little bit longer to dry, and that Best Ever Craft tape holds it just enough. I only need it to hold it till I have it glued to the front of my card. Once it's glued to the front of my card, the thread end is between those two cardstock pieces, and it's not going to go anywhere. While my background is drying on my card base, I can assemble my tree here. It's so easy to assemble. The pieces line up on top of each other except for the top of the tree. That piece just tucks in right behind. There's a nice piece that fits right in behind that tree there. For the sentiment, you can either pick and choose where you want it to go. It could go underneath the tree, it could go over top of the tree, or you could even put it on the inside of the card if you want. I chose to put it on the front of the card. I kind of thought it finished it off just a tiny little bit more, but it's really wherever you want it to go. You could also put it on the front of the card and then put a longer sentiment stamped on the inside of the card. If you wanted to do that, though, I would probably do that before starting to put your die cuts onto the front of it. You do definitely want something to hold down those pieces while they're drying, just because it is being held onto something that is stitched. Now, my first choice would have been those crystal adhesive gems, but I didn't have enough for all of the little dots that I had here, so I'm using some nail gems. Nail gems come in a whole bunch of different sizes, but they're nice and tiny, so I find they're perfect for card making, and they're really quite economical. So I just glue them down with the same Barely Art glue, put dots of the glue in the holes of those die cuts, and then use a jewel picker to pick up those gems and place them exactly where I want them to go. And then I just let that dry, and it really doesn't take a long time for them to dry either, but they go in really, really quick and easily. If you're using the adhesive gems, what I tend to do is use a die pick just to kind of pierce into the adhesive behind the gem, place it where I want it to go on the card, and then push it down with my other hand just to give that adhesive a little bit more contact. Whatever works, or whichever one you choose, will absolutely work for this. I do love the fact that those nail gems sparkle so beautifully in there, and it really finishes off and completes that card. For my next card, I'm going to be using the String Lights stitched die set. I have a bunch of them that I did off screen, but I am going to do some on screen. For my background, I have that embossed with the Evergreen embossing folder. It just has a tiny little bit of texture. And then I took a gold Brilliance pad and just lightly brushed that on the front just to get a little bit of gold highlight and enhance that embossed background. I don't want so much ink on there that I'm taking away from my stitched lights, but I just like the extra little texture that it gives that background. I made that background fairly dark. It's die cut and embossed out of forest cardstock because the strings for my lights were die cut out of fern cardstock, and I wanted them to be able to be seen and not just blend into that background. So that's why I made that background darker, and that Brilliance Gold pad just kind of lightens it up just a touch. So for the stitching for the lights, the format is exactly the same as the other ones. I will put my string through there, use a tiny little piece of the Best Ever Craft tape to tape it in place. And when I'm taping it in place, I'm really trying not to put any of that tape in front of the holes to interfere with my stitching or to show through in any way, shape, or form. Just like my tree, I die cut a solid of the light, then inserted the stitching pieces, and then die cut some stitching light dies or light die cuts. So I have some here done in red, and I also have some done in white. I'm doing all of my stitching for this card also in that gold floss. It looks beautiful on both that white as well as that red, and it ties in beautifully with that gold ink that I'm using on the background. So the stitching for both of the die cuts are exactly the same, and then once I'm done the stitching, I will tape that in place with my Best Ever Craft tape and then glue a solid piece to the back of it. It's one of those steps that you don't necessarily have to do, but I like doing it because not only does it give it a good background to it, it gives it something, a cardstock area to glue from. It helps with that gluing, but it also gives just a tiny bit of extra dimension by having that extra piece back there. I've even heard of people that like to do their stitching pieces twice and glue them together before doing the stitching, just to give that a little bit of extra stability. I don't find that's necessary, and because I'm using the Spellbinders cardstock here, it's nice and heavy, and I don't find I need any of that extra thickness. But if you're using some cardstock that's just a little bit thinner, and maybe you're finding it's just bending a little bit too much while you're stitching, that might be the solution for you. Die cut those stitching pieces twice and layer them together first before doing your stitching. Once the lights are dried, once the background has dried to the front, we can glue that down to the top part of the light bulb, and then I like to set that aside to dry. I like to make sure that that's nice and dry before starting to assemble my card. It just makes things a little bit easier. For this card, I did use my Treasured Gold cardstock pack again. I'm using the pearl one for a mat. I have that cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8, and then my embossed piece here is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. While I have my acrylic block on there, letting that dry, I'm just going to place my die cuts just to make sure that I know exactly where they want to go. Now, what I ended up doing, I wanted to do 2 strings of lights on here. I didn't want those strings to be exactly the same, and the only way to get them to not be exactly the same was to flip one over so the back side is showing. And I typically don't like to have the back side showing. I just don't like the finished look. But for the look, the final look that I was going for, it just is the way to go, and it made sense. So I do have one of my light strings here with the back side up, just so that it wasn't mirrored or exactly the same for both levels. Letting that dry for a few moments, and then once that has dried for a few moments, I'm going to start gluing my lights down. Now, when I'm gluing my lights down, I don't press down. I have just placed them, which works out good because I end up changing my placement on them. And basically, when I say changing my placement, I'm just reversing where the red lights and the white lights are. And that's because when I was finished gluing all of these lights down, I went to put my sentiment down. And because that sentiment is on white cardstock, I had the white cardstock sentiment just slightly in front of one of the white lights, and thought it would look better if it was in front of one of the red lights. So when you see me replacing everything or swapping everything, that's the reason I'm doing it. I'm swapping them in exactly the same placement, so it wasn't that the placement was wrong or I didn't like the placement. I just didn't like that one white light right behind the sentiment. So I just swapped them out, just the colors. But again, I only place these down, and that's another bonus of using liquid glue, is you have a little bit more wiggle room. You can move things around a little bit more. The glue dries nice and clear, so I don't have to worry about it being visible if I move it to a different place. Here I didn't move anything to a different place. I just swapped out the colors. Now, Because we are gluing on top of an embossed background, once I have everything placed properly, I am going to put that acrylic block on there just to hold everything down to make sure it has good contact with that background, because it's not gluing down, or because we're only gluing to the raised part of that embossed background. The other thing that I did was I have some of my lights facing down, some of them flipped facing up. I just like that layout type look with it. If you want them all facing down, you absolutely can. Or if you want them all facing up, you absolutely can. It's just personal preference. But I love all the texture that you get from this background between the stitching of those lights and that embossed background that there is. Now my strings hang out just a tiny little bit, so I'm just using a scissors to trim that down a little bit, and then we are ready to work on our last card. So for this one, there is 2 different lights in that string light die set. One that is the same shape as the one that I did previous, and then there's some round lights. And while I could have done another card with lights, but round lights, I thought it would be fun to do them as ornaments. Now they're fairly tiny ornaments because they're not really big die cuts. You could mix and match them with some larger circles just to get a little bit of size variation to them. But for this card, I kept them all the same size, though it's the size that is in the die set, and I really like how it turned out. I have a background die cut out of fern cardstock that I embossed with the ornament embossing folder. And then I did the same thing as I did with the last one, inking up my background, but this time I used the Silver Brilliance pad, just very lightly, just highlighting a little bit of the texture from that ornament background. And I chose the silver because some of these die cuts are silver, and the red and white die cuts I'm going to be stitching with the silver floss. For this silver ornament, I'm just stitching it with the white floss. It's going to coordinate beautifully with the white ornaments. And I didn't want to do the silver floss because I figured it was going to just blend with each other. Another option would have been using some red floss, but the floss that I have is variegated, so it has some pink tones to it. And for these cards, I didn't want to have that. I didn't have any solid red floss to use, so I like it with the white floss anyways. Once the pieces are done being stitched, I'm doing exactly the same thing as before. I have a solid die cut that I'm gluing to the back, using my reverse tweezers to hold those in place while I'm stitching the next die cut. Now these die cuts are exactly the same as the light bulbs, as in they have a hole in the middle and holes all around the outside, so you can stitch from the outside to the inside hole or the inside to the outside hole. It's never going to make a difference with the look of it, but I do tape that floss in place when I start and when I finish. I also hold my die cut with my thumb and my pointer finger, and then hold onto the floss with my pinky and my ring finger, just to keep it nice and straight, nice and out of my way. And every once in a while, if I notice that floss is starting to twist on itself, you'll notice that I kind of hold it up and let that untwist on itself, and that works absolutely beautifully. Because these pieces are fairly small, I don't cut as long of pieces of the floss either, so that gives you less chance of it twisting on itself as well. Once each of the pieces are dried, I'm going to add the ornament top. Now I know these aren't traditional ornament tops. I used the same die cut for the light bulb top. I wanted to keep everything with the same die set. And you can see when you look at the finished card, it looks just fine, not being a traditional ornament top like die cut. So once all of my pieces are done, I cut a bunch of different lengths of that silver cord, about 3 to 4 inches in length, and I'm taping them to the top of those ornaments. Now I want these ornaments to look like they're hanging, so by taping that floss onto the back of there, I can adjust where I want this on my card, and then I'm going to tape the top of that floss to the back of my card. So I've already glued down some silver mirror cardstock to my card base. The dimensions for that piece and this embossed green piece is exactly the same. So that silver mirrored cardstock is cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8, and this green embossed piece is cut to 5 1/4 by 4 inches. For my ornaments, gluing them to the front of my card, I'm just doing like clusters of 3. And for each cluster of 3, I'm using 1 red ornament, 1 white ornament, and 1 silver ornament. I just like the way it looks. You don't have to do it this way. You can change it up. You can do all different colors if you want, or you can have them all the same color if you want. I tend to like fairly simple color palettes when it comes to Christmas stuff, but I love the fact that there are so many different options. You can really customize it to how you want them to go. Once they are, each ornament cluster is dried, you can tie the floss to the top of the card. Now, I didn't do it with this first cluster of 3, but I will do it after this second cluster of 3. I will tape that floss down and then I will trim off the excess. I found that after the second cluster, it got a little bit unruly behind that card there. And by trimming those pieces down, it just made it a little bit more neat to work with. So you can see how I'm placing those flosses. I'm just putting them how I want on the front and then just holding them on the back while I tape that in place. Because this piece is going to be glued down to the card base, you're never going to see this tape behind here, and you also are never going to see the tape behind those ornament pieces, but it just holds them down in place enough so that you can get that placement right. Now that I'm done the second cluster, I'm going to glue down the third cluster, and I'm trying to make sure that the placement of the ornaments on each cluster is a little bit different so that I don't have repeated patterns. It's just a personal preference. I also find that it's easiest, as I've already done, to glue down the ornament cluster, let that dry, and then place the thread. For the first one, and I did it, I deleted that part of the video, is I tried to do it a little bit sooner and I found that the ornament just fell off the front because the glue hadn't set enough. So by letting that dry and letting it set so that that is not going to move, it's just going to make your life a little bit easier. Now that this piece is done, I can glue the green embossed piece to the card base, or to on top of that silver piece on the card base. And this silver piece, as well as those silver die cuts, are also with the treasured cardstock pack. This is the silver version, and I'm using the brushed cardstock for it. It's very similar to the mirror cardstock, except it has just kind of little lines in it. So it has just a different texture to it that I really like. Then I glued on my sentiment to that front, and we have a new completed card. I glued the sentiment right on those strings there. I kind of felt that area needed some filling in. You could also glue it down below your ornaments as well, and it would look absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you have a fantastic day.